Thank you, Sarah. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor David DiValerio, who is an associate professor of religious studies and history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. David is, I think some of you already know some of his previous work. He's really interested in himself in what you could say are Tibetan contemplative experts, adepts, sort of intense contemplative practice. His book, The Holy Madman of Tibet, is a really interesting expose on the figure of the sort of mad yogi. And more recently, his forthcoming work, it's coming out, when is it? It's like this month, right? Next week. Mountain Dharma, Meditative Retreat in the Tibetan Ascetic Self is coming out from Columbia University Press next week. I've managed to dip into an advanced copy. Thank you, David. And it's really a really great work. I think it's going to be groundbreaking. David is actually involved with me in a project to study a 3-year retreat, an upcoming 3-year retreat, both scientifically and through the lenses of the humanities, anthropology, and so on. And in his talk today, I'm personally really looking forward to, because it's even though the 3-year retreat is such an incredibly important kind of context for not just the training of persons in Tibetan Buddhism, and I say persons, not just Tibetans, but people around the world, but also a kind of authority structure that serves to establish oneself and a certain status within the community. So I'm just fascinated to hear what David has to say. There's so much to say. I'm sure we'll only be able to cover part of what is in the book, but I think it'll be a great teaser for the book. So without further ado, David.
So thanks to everyone who helped put this together today. Thanks in particular to John, who's been one of my biggest supporters over the last decade or so, and I really appreciate that. So I was last here about 100 years ago in February 2020. At that time, I presented some research from a work in progress about the history of individual long-term meditative retreat in Tibetan Buddhism. So take note, for this first part, I'm going to be talking about individual retreat, and I'll be transitioning to talking about communal retreat for my actual talk today. In that presentation I gave in 2020, I was talking about how authors of a number of manuals for how to do retreat differently problematized the issue of food. So I began with Yangompa Gyaltsen Pel's famous text, The Blazing Jewel, the Mountain Dharma that is the source of all good qualities. This is probably the most influential retreat manual of the pre-modern period. In this text, Yangompa problematizes food for the way its consumption can negatively affect the person who eats it. He says that by eating certain kinds of food, the mind stream of the meditator will become cloudy. So his main interest is in the sort of what happens when food crosses what I call the alimentary threshold of the individual. At that moment of consumption, how does it affect the meditator? So he's concerned with consumption, and he basically treats food as an object of suspicion. From there, I moved on to Zorman Lekshe Drayang's Words of the Mountain Dharma, the melody producing nothing but good. Now, this text dedicates an entire chapter to the issue of food. And in that chapter, Zorman Lekshe Drayang details 3 possible ways that a retreatant might relate to food during a long-term retreat. The first option is to have no plan whatsoever. The second option is to use the yogic alchemical process of essence extraction, or Julen in Tibetan. And the third option is to periodically break your retreat in order to go visit human settlements and gather food. Lekshe Drayang argues that the first of these is simply unacceptable, because a yogi who goes into retreat with no plan for how to sustain themselves will inevitably become a burden to their Dharma brothers and their Lama and so on. The second option, the yogic practice of Julen, the alchemical practice of Julen, Lekshe Drayang argues is probably not feasible for the meditator who might be reading his manual. He says that doing the practice of Julen requires high-level yogic accomplishment, it requires special esoteric wisdom, and therefore it's almost impossible to do successfully during our current world age. So Lekshe Drayang presents the third possibility, periodic begging, as the only real option. So he gives a number of prescriptions for how you can break your retreat, go to the village, gather food, and come back without sort of losing your basic ascetic bearing. So here, rather than the consumption of food, it's its acquisition that Lekshe Drayam is most concerned with. At this point, I cited a number of other authors who also talk about essence extraction in the same way as Lekshe Drayam, who basically say that this is a technique best reserved for those who are more spiritually advanced than you, or who lived long ago, or both. This is a point I'll be returning to shortly. Then in the early 20th century, Drakar Losang Pelden writes in his Garland of Pearl, the mountain dharma requisite for all dharma practitioners staying in isolated places, about how to prevent people bearing provisions from arriving at your retreat too often and disturbing you, and how to avoid slipping into hypocritical relationships with your donors. Because of this represents a kind of slippery slope, morally speaking, Drakar Losang Pelden talks about sort of maintaining a constant vigilance and a sort of actively defensive stance on behalf of the meditator to sort of keep the outside world at bay. Now, whereas Yangompa made almost no reference to the question of how the ascetic would acquire the food to support themselves during the retreat, by about 700 years later, this topic had been subject to extensive elaboration within the tradition. So this was just kind of my early thinking about this part of the project. Over the next few years, as I continued to work on this further, this grew into chapter 4 of my forthcoming book, Mountain Dharma, which comes out next week. And I have a copy here, which I'll pass around. The principal source material for this study is a series of 29 texts written between the 12th century and the early decades of the 20th century, all of which provide prescriptions for how to live in long-term retreat. And I've highlighted the 3 texts I just mentioned here. So we have Yangompa, Lekshe Drayam, and then we have Drakar Losang Pelden. So yes, this is a series of texts. 29 of them, almost all these texts have the phrase Riche, Ragiguri, Charo Chosache, meaning mountain dharma in their titles, which is where I get the name for my book. So the first chapter of the book sort of gives a survey of this literature. I think it's very useful for various kinds of research projects. It's not very well known to this point. So chapter 1 gives an overview. Then chapters 2 through 6 respectively focus on these texts' treatment of the question of where to do retreat, how to maintain interpersonal isolation, how to relate to food, chapter 4, nourishing the ascetic self. Chapter 5 is about how to counteract bodily threats, such as sickness, cold weather, and bandits. And chapter 6 is about how to relate to the spiritual lineage. Viewing these prescriptions as technologies of personhood, these chapters trace a genealogy of the Tibetan ascetic self. The central argument of the book concerns a repeated pattern that is discerned when tracking the tradition's prescriptions about these very diverse facets of the ascetic undertaking. With respect to these very different concerns, in the latter centuries of the tradition, we see it asserted with increasing frequency that there is an ideal way of relating to the matter at hand, as exemplified by the asceticism performed by the past masters of the tradition, but which is no longer feasible. We saw this in the tradition's treatment of food. Zorman Lekshe Drayam and others from the 16th century onward would mention the technique of essence extraction, by which a person transmutes ordinary foodstuffs and even more mundane materials like rocks and air into powerful life-sustaining materials. This theoretically enables a meditator to live entirely off the grid and outside the social matrix. Lekshe Drayam and others point to examples like the 11th century Saint Milarepa, who sustained himself for years by essence extraction. But what Lekshe Drayam and others instruct their latter-day imagined readers to pursue is in fact a lesser form of ascetic abiding. This establishes a gap in both time and in yogic ability between the present-day meditator and those great masters who came long before. I argue that when contextualized by such an assertion, to then break your retreat to go begging, as Lekshe Drayam prescribes, becomes an expression of the latter-day meditator's place in the dimension of time. I refer to this attitude as lived deferential reverence, whereby the form of asceticism that one lives by becomes an expression of a deferential positioning with respect to what the tradition most reveres. I argue that over the centuries considered in this study, this stance becomes a defining part of the Tibetan eremitic habitus. As a corollary to this attitude of lived deferential reverence becoming a normative component of the tradition's treatment of issues as varied as place, food, people, and so on, I argue that the central trajectory in the history of the Tibetan ascetic self is an increasing tendency to understand the retreatant as existing in an ever more defined relationship to the dimension of time. This is a direct consequence of the tradition's thinking of the retreatant as existing at an ever greater remove from the possibility of higher spiritual accomplishment, which recedes from the horizon of possibility over time. As I show in the final part of chapter 6, whereas earlier authors like Yangompa treated enlightenment as a very real possibility, the ins and outs of which the retreatant ought to be informed of, later authors refrain from such discussion, at times explicitly ascribing to themselves and their readers the status of mere beginners, les Damboa. So now I'm going to begin to segue into the research project that I'm here to talk about today. Chapter 7, The Tibetan Ascetic Self in Time, begins by noting the ubiquity of the expectation among Tibetan Buddhists around the world today that a meditative retreat should last specifically for a period of 3 years and 3 fortnights, or 3 years and 3 months. The ubiquity of this expectation, I argue, is evinced by the development in recent decades of alternative manners of completing the 3-year, 3-month retreat. So note that before I was talking primarily about individual retreat, now I'm sort of transitioning into talking about communal retreat, which is a separate but related phenomenon. So for example, Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia has since 1990 hosted 7 different groups of meditators, totaling 64 individuals who have completed 3-year, 3-month retreats on a 1 year in, 1 year out schedule. The endeavor therefore taking more than 5 years from start to finish, with 2 groups of meditators on overlapping timelines. Some retreat centers in the West offer the opportunity to follow along with the retreat, with the meditative curriculum while living on the outside. Over 3 years, individuals receive the tantric empowerments and instructions along with the retreatants via video conference and do their best to keep up with the prescribed amount of practice while carrying on with their careers and family life. It has also become common in the last few decades for Euro-American Tibetan Buddhists to commit to completing a 3-year, 3-month retreat in installments, piecing it together 1 month, week, day, or hour of meditation at a time. The growing popularity of these options indicates just how central a position the 3-year, 3-month retreat now occupies in the way practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism think about meditation. The ideal has become so normative that it has spawned alternative means of adhering to it. Having established the pervasiveness of the expectation today that a retreat should last specifically for 3 years and 3 months, Chapter 7 traces the history of this category in the individual retreat tradition. Although this expectation derives from late tantric scriptures like the Kala Chakra, a systematic examination of retreat manuals shows that the expectation of completing 3 years and 3 months of meditation had essentially no currency within the individual retreat tradition prior to the 17th century. The first of these 29 texts to even mention this ideal is Karma Chakme's Direct Advice on Retreat, written in 1665. This text reflects a meditative culture in which the ideal of meditating for 3 years and 3 fortnights was known, but by no means had the totalizing influence that it has today. In Chapter 7, I argue that the increasing prevalence of the ideal of meditating specifically for 3 years and 3 months was part of the rise of the attitude of lived deferential reverence, and that it served to concretely define the latter-day meditator as a being in time. So this brings me to the project I'm here to talk about today, a study of the 3-year, 3-month communal retreat as it's currently practiced within the Tibetan Buddhist community around the world. Over the next 25 minutes, I will give an overview of the project, followed by a bit more detail about what the 3-year, 3-month retreat actually consists of. Then I'll walk you through some of what I've found to be interesting and potentially significant, kind of mixed together with some things that I hope to look into further in the years ahead. So early findings and ongoing questions. Then I'll conclude with some speculative reflections about what all of this might mean about Tibetan Buddhism and contemplative practice in the world today. If all this seems half-baked and underdeveloped, that's because it is. I'm still in the early stages of my research for this project. I still have a long way to go. I'll probably be working on this for the next 10 years, among other projects. So to begin with an overview, what am I doing with this project? The basic idea is to conduct field work in places where the communal 3-year, 3-month retreat has been practiced in order to gain a better understanding of how it has been adapted to suit the needs and expectations of very different constituencies of the Tibetan Buddhist community around the world. I hope this to be revealing of the 3-year, 3-month retreat's vital role in constituting Tibetan Buddhism as a globalized religion, which John alluded to in his introduction. This research participates in a larger trend that I'm trying to actively foster, which is to study contemplative traditions through a systematic examination of the contexts in which contemplative practice takes place. Mountain Dharma does this regarding individual retreat historically. With this new project, I'm focusing on communal retreat and moving into our contemporary period, which requires a different methodology. But both projects approach their subject through the question of context. Now, my original plan for this project was to compare how the 3-year retreat was being practiced in 4 areas: France, the United States, Nepal, and Eastern Tibet. I may also include some other locations such as Portugal and Vietnam and other places where new retreat centers are being built, because there's some very interesting developments taking place in those other areas. So we'll see what form the project ultimately takes. To this point, I've done 4 months of fieldwork for this project in France, Nepal, and the United States, specifically in Colorado, Arizona, and Arkansas. Most of my interviews have been with people who have completed 1 or more of these retreats. Some of them have gone on to serve as retreat masters. I've also interviewed a handful of people who are preparing for a 3-year retreat. In total, I've done 95 hours of interviews in English, Tibetan, and French with 75 people associated with 35 different retreat centers. Most recently, I spent 6 weeks in Nepal this past spring. I've not yet done any of the field work in Eastern Tibet, so everything I say today doesn't really apply to Tibet. An important thing to keep in mind is that for the most part, people currently in retreat are out of bounds for this project. Can't talk to people while they're in retreat. So I'm mostly talking to people after retreat or before retreat. In Nepal this past spring, I did end up having a conversation with a guy who was in retreat. This was not my intention, but that's just how it goes when you're doing field work. And he and I could speak, but we were not allowed to see each other. So we had to talk through a curtain that was hanging over the doorway that created the barrier between the inside and the outside of the retreat. So in these interviews, I'm doing a few different things simultaneously. For one, I'm gathering basic information about these retreat centers and their histories, sort of who, what, when, and where. This is for the purpose of establishing the basic facts about these retreat centers. They're all over the world. We don't have a good idea of where they are or where what their histories are and so on. So part of this project is sort of just establishing those basics. I'm also asking demographic questions about the retreatants themselves, who they are, at what point in their life they did their retreat, what their preparation was like prior to the retreat, how it fit into their spiritual career. I'm also interested in meditators' more subjective reflections on the retreat, what they got out of it, what was most surprising, what were the biggest challenges, and how they understand what they did to fit into the history of meditation in Tibetan Buddhism. For each of these interviews, I have a series of questions that I plan to ask, but I'm also sort of open to wherever the conversation takes us based on what the retreatant wants to tell me. I'm specifically casting a wide net in these conversations. So during these first 95 hours of interviews with people, I still feel like I'm being educated about this phenomenon, right? This is all very foreign to me. At this point, I'm just sort of learning about it so that I can hopefully come up with more informed and specific research questions that I'll pursue in the years ahead. So having given this overview of the project, I'll now give some specifics about what the 3-year, 3-month retreat actually is. Where is it practiced? What are its basic parameters? Where does it come from? Some of my early findings and ongoing questions are sort of going to come up as I'm presenting these basics about what the 3-year retreat is. So the retreat typically involves between 4 and 12 or so men or women who live together inside of a cloister for a minimum of 3 years and 3 months. These retreats typically begin and end on important Buddhist holidays, and they can also be extended at the discretion of the retreat master. So 3 years and 3 months is a minimum. They often last at least a few months longer than that. These retreats are almost always gender segregated. I know of one place in France that allows committed couples to do the retreat together, but no new relationships are allowed to form during the retreat. And I actually spoke to a number of people who are in a 3-year retreat with a couple who broke up in the middle of the retreat. And they talked about how difficult that was for the entire group. This is one of the things that's very unique about the retreat. It is a closed sort of, like inside of an aquarium, and you can't get out. So you're stuck with these people, whatever is going on, good or bad. So this is one of the interesting things that comes out of my conversations with people. The physical infrastructure for these retreats varies enormously. The first retreat that took place in the West happened in this chateau in Burgundy. It began in 1976. They were sort of exploring. This was the first retreat that took place outside of Asia. They hadn't adapted the building all that much. The men and women were on separate floors, and they were just basically in there. Here's another place in France. This is a center that's been hosting retreats for a few decades now. And it's a series of old farm buildings that have been sort of walled off and adapted lightly in order to host retreats. Other places have newer purpose-built structures. Now, this center in France boasts the fact that each retreatant has their own room, but they also have their own separate bathrooms, which is an important advancement, since shared bathrooms is one of the most common sources of conflict in Euro-American retreat centers. Now, this building it's perfectly mirrored. So there's the men's side and the women's side, and there's a wall in between the two, and the two sides are perfect mirrors of one another. Or the retreat quarters can be sort of more like cabins, as we have here in France, or like at this center in Arizona. So this area in Arizona, at this center, there's sort of a series of these cabins sort of spread out over a hillside. And then around that, there's an area sort of cordoned off. There's a sign here that says, "Do not enter, silent 3-year retreat in progress." And you can see some of these cabins in the background. These retreats are not normally completely silent. Often the meditators speak to one another between sessions, including over meals. Sometimes they have kind of off days when they can chat and so on. It's not common that they're expected to be completely silent. Now, one of the challenges at this retreat center in Arizona is dealing with the heat and dealing with the cold. So it's been a topic of discussion within this tradition for a number of decades now about whether or not retreat centers should be heated. Almost none of them are. The standard form for a sort of traditional Tibetan retreat center is to have a building with a central courtyard. And on 3 or 4 sides around that, you have the temple, you have the individual rooms that the retreatants stay in, the bathroom, kitchen, whatever, all sort of opening onto that central courtyard. I think of it as a building with its sort of back turned to the world on all 4 sides. And if this building had been purpose-built as a retreat center, it wouldn't have windows, or would have far fewer windows. The fact that this has windows shows that this was not originally a retreat center. It's a building in Parping that has been retroactively made into a retreat center. One of the things you will often see are curtains. So when there's a window where there really shouldn't be one, they often put up curtains in order to prevent the retreatants from seeing people outside and to prevent people from seeing the retreatants on the inside. Now, the sort of outer barrier of the retreat will often be marked with various signs and sort of invocations of protector deities, which are part of a process of sort of ritually sealing the space, which is then closed off. The retreatants are not allowed to leave the space, often, only in case of emergency, like if they have to go to the hospital or something. The retreat master typically comes and goes. There are some retreat centers where the retreat master basically stays there, but can go out. At most retreat centers, the retreat master stays somewhere else, and he just comes to visit periodically to give teachings and empowerments, talk to the retreatants and so on as needed. So there's this sort of defined boundary, but also a little bit of coming back and forth. Now, this is a retreat center in Nepal where every retreatant has their own sort of little house that they live in. And there's two things I want to point out that are shown here. One is this white stone marker outside the door, which sort of represents the sort of boundary between the interior and the exterior of the retreat. The retreat manuals that I work with for Mountain Dharma mention some version of this going all the way back to the 13th century. So people have different interpretations of what this stone marker should look like, but here's an example of it being used today. The retreat master here is also pointing out the portal that is used to communicate with the outside world. So these retreat houses, the front door can remain closed, but there's a little door that they can use to put food in, put offerings in. If the retreatant needs something, he can write a note saying, I need this, and he can get what he needs and so on. So this provides this sort of access to the world outside. So a basic parameter of the retreat is that there's always a boundary drawn somewhere, whether outside individual retreat cells, around the cloister in which the retreatants stay, or marking a wider boundary around the complex's building. How these boundaries are different drawn and maintained is one of the things that often comes up and seems interesting to me from my fieldwork. Reflecting on this a bit, I think these physical boundaries will always be found to be in the service of maintaining interpersonal boundaries, right? That really is the principal concern here, maintaining separation from people on the outside. At most Western retreat centers, retreatants are allowed to maintain contact with the outside world through snail mail. I'm in correspondence with someone in retreat in the United States right now, but every letter is held for 2 weeks before it's given to him, and every letter he sends me is held for 2 weeks before it's allowed to go out. So it's interesting to me to look at these sort of mechanisms that are put in place to kind of maintain a buffer between the inside and the outside while still allowing for communication to take place. This is kind of an interesting question that comes up at pretty much every retreat center. Continuing with the question of the physical infrastructure, each retreatant typically has their own room where they spend most of their time. Their individual rooms will almost always have an altar and either a bed or a wooden box that looks like this. At some retreat centers, it is expected that the meditator will sleep sitting upright in the box, being explicitly forbidden from lying down. Remaining upright is said to promote continuing one's meditation, or at least maintaining a contemplative awareness while asleep at night. This is in the service of putting the ideal of putting the entire 3 years and 3 months to meditative practice. I spoke to a retreat master in Nepal, who's been a retreat master for a very long time. And he says at 10 p.m., he walks around to make sure all the retreatants are sitting in their boxes. It's sort of like the final check of the night. And he goes back at 4 a.m. to make sure they're in their boxes again, because that's when the morning session begins. And he said that in between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., he's not that concerned with what they do. So he sort of showed me ways that you can kind of slump in the box. You can stick your legs out. There's ways you can sleep in the box while getting a little bit more comfortable. This is an interesting question, right? Do we stick with the box or not? Every retreat center I go to, I ask about this, and I get all different answers about the utility of this. At most retreat centers in the West, they eat at least one meal together per day. At Western retreat centers, the meal tends to be kind of a social time. They talk to one another, they sit together and so on. In the West, there's a big problem of how to feed the retreatants. At some centers, they kind of take turns making food for the entire group. At some retreat centers in the West, everyone cooks their own food individually. Meanwhile, in Nepal, there's almost always a staff that cooks food for the retreatants every day. This is because labor costs. In Nepal, it's much cheaper. In the West, it's hard to find someone who's willing to put in the time and the work to do all that. So this is a big challenge that retreat centers in the West are always sort of negotiating how to deal with feeding the retreatants. There's almost always a sort of runner on the outside who will make weekly trips to the grocery store for the retreatants. In Nepal, almost all the retreatants are monks and nuns. They're usually in their 20s, sometimes their 30s, and they don't have to pay anything for the retreat. In the West, the retreatants are almost always lay people. Age-wise, they vary from people in their 20s, and then there's a lot of people sort of in their 60s, not that many people in between. And in the West, they typically have to pay around $1,000 a month in order to be in the retreat, in order to cover expenses. So it costs something like $40,000. There are almost always 4 individual sessions per day that last a minimum of 2 hours. Most centers also have 1 or 2 group sessions each day when the retreatants get together and perform a liturgy. Most of the retreat centers, there's 9 or so in France, are in the south, with a cluster in the Dordogne. At some point in the 2000s, the largest of these centers in France, Dr. Kundraling, had more than 100 people in 3-year retreat at the same time. They had 10 separate cloisters, some for men, some for women. Some were Anglophone, some were Francophone, and so on. Since then, since the passing of their charismatic leader, there's a lot less interest in retreat in this community, and now they're only using 2 of the cloisters. And they're faced with the question of what do we do with those other cloisters that are still setting there? In the United States, the retreat centers are pretty well dispersed. You have them in California, in the Southwest. I mentioned that place in Arkansas, and a few in upstate New York, and then Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia. And there's a cluster of 3 or 4 retreat centers, depending how you count, in Crestone, Colorado. I've not yet made a good map of where the retreat centers are in Nepal. Indicated in this map are a mixture of retreat centers and other monasteries. There's probably about 40 of these places in Nepal, in Kathmandu, Parping, Namo Buddha, Yolmo, Labchi, and so on. In Nepal, there are probably 4 or 5 at least retreat centers currently under construction. So there'll be more in the years ahead. So how did these retreat centers come to be where they are? This necessitates a little bit of slight detour to sort of talk about the history of this tradition. So a key figure in this story is Jamgon Kongtrul, born in 1813. He's an extremely influential polymath who participated in the Rimé or ecumenical movement in Eastern Tibet. In 1860s, he established this retreat center called Sadra. During his lifetime, he oversaw 9 3-year, 3-month retreats there. Here you can kind of see into the retreat complex, and you can see how there's all those rooms opening onto the central courtyard. This is kind of a classical model for this. Kongtrul wrote a charter in, I think it was 1865, that specifically lays out how the retreat should be practiced at this specific center. So he talks about the qualifications of potential retreatants, how to prepare for the retreat curriculum, the liturgies that are practiced on daily, monthly, and annual schedules, rules for the retreatants to follow, and so on. This text was translated into English in 1994 and into French in 1997. Now, you'll often hear people say that Jamgon Kongtrul invented the communal 3-year, 3-month retreat. Some people attribute this to his teacher, the 9th Taisitu, Pema Nyingje Wangpo. Neither of those things is correct. We have references to people practicing the Losum Choksum, or 3-year, 3-fortnight retreat from as far back as the 15th century. And there are certainly people practicing it prior to that, specifically within the Jonang sect. Now, the fact that people attribute this to Jamgon Kongtrul is just sort of a testament to the influence of him and his lineage in spreading the 3-year retreat around the world today. And this is specifically through the activities of Kala Rinpoche. So he was born in 1905, which was about 6 years after the death of Jamgon Kongtrul. Sometimes he's thought to be a reincarnation of Jamgon Kongtrul. He did his first 3-year, 3-month retreat at Sadra in the 1940s. Then he became, he did his first retreat there as a teenager, became the retreat master around 1940. Then after going into exile in 1955, he established a series of retreat centers in Bhutan and India. At the direction of the 16th Karmapa, he began teaching in the West, and he was the retreat master for that first retreat in Burgundy, beginning in 1976. After that, he would establish a number of retreat centers in the West. So we can sort of chart the history of his activities and sort of related activities and centers that are sort of, following the footsteps of what he established. And that sort of tells the story of the spread of these retreat centers in the West. It also seems that the 3 or 3 month retreat is sort of still rising in importance among Tibetan Buddhist communities in Nepal. And I can't really speak about this specifically, but I sense that it's also of growing importance in Tibet as well. And I'll provide one sort of tantalizing bit of information suggesting that. So this is Wangchen Rinpoche, who lives in Northern California, but he has a center in Eastern Tibet. He is a disciple of Kalu Rinpoche. And a few years ago, he announced his intention of building 108 new retreat centers in Eastern Tibet. I don't know if that project is going forward, but that really suggests that this is sort of growing and of ever increasing importance. I think we can say very safely that the 3 or 3 month retreat is more important in Tibetan Buddhism today than it has been at any point in the last 1,000 years of Tibetan Buddhist history. So before this digression to talk about the history of the tradition, I was talking about the sort of basic parameters of what the 3 or 3 month retreat actually consists of. A big question that I haven't addressed yet is that of curriculum. What are these people doing all day? This is part of the basic parameters of the retreat, but looking at how retreat centers negotiate the question of what the retreat should actually consist of gets us into the really fundamental deliberations on behalf of these communities, exposing deep assumptions about what this kind of retreat and contemplative practice itself is all about. So here I'm sort of transitioning from simpler issues to sort of bigger, knottier issues. To get to the question of the retreat curriculum, it's useful to go back and consider what Jongbom Kongtrul's version of retreat consists of. He wrote that charter so we know exactly what the retreatants were expected to be doing, basically week by week throughout the entire 3 years and 3 months. For the first 5 months, the retreatants do the preliminary practices, which is a set of 4 ritual exercises, each of which must be repeated 100,000 times. This is preparation for Tantra. One thing that this does is that this formalizes the meditator's position as a beginner, sort of defining them as a beginner since they're expected to do this at the beginning of the retreat. From there, on a set schedule, they progress through practices associated with 3 different sectarian traditions: the Kagyu, Jonang/Kala Chakra, and then the Nyingma. So this reflects Kongtrul's participation in the ecumenical Rimé movement at the time. After the preliminaries, the meditators receive empowerment for the Shangpa Kagyu deities and practices. Then the retreatant must complete 700,000 recitations of a particular mantra, along with the accompanying visualizations, and then 400,000 recitations of the next mantra, 100,000 recitations of the next mantra, and then 40,000 recitations for another. Then there are 5 other mantras that have to be recited 100,000 times each. Punctuating all of this are periods when an intensive group ritual must be completed over a series of days. Then the retreatants receive instructions on and practice each of the 6 yogas of Naropa. And there's 100,000 more of this, 100,000 more of this, and so on over the first 15 months. It's just the first 15 months I've been talking about. It is jam-packed. Then they move on to the Kala Chakra, which has a new set of preliminary practices that have to be finished, during which they have a period of a month and a half, during which they strive to complete 10 million recitations of a particular mantra for a new set of deities. Then there are a series of more advanced yogic practices. Then they move on to the Nyingma, which is kind of like the last year of the retreat, with 100,000 recitations of this and 100,000 recitations of that, and on and on. So this is a tantric retreat. The recitation of each of these mantras, the prescribed number of times, serves to formalize the meditator's relationship with the deity in question. Upon completion of Kongtrul's program, an individual would be a fully legitimate holder of these lineages, fully trained in these tantric yogas, and fully empowered to meditatively interact with a whole array of tantric deities, In this basic model of retreat, I view the meditator as treated as kind of like a vessel into which these different lineages are being poured. Afterwards, the retreatant is responsible for preserving the tradition and potentially passing it on to others. This is also an incredible amount of work. I know of no retreat center in the West that attempts anything close to what has been prescribed by Kongtrul. Even doing just part of this is daunting. Meditators in Nepal who I've spoken to, who have done retreats even loosely based on this model, talk about how much pressure they feel every day to complete a certain number of prostrations or recitations or whatever. They talk about feeling this sort of incessant need to go faster. Sometimes they extend their sessions to prevent themselves from falling farther and farther behind. It's sort of this relentless kind of intense religious work. So if we think of Kongtrul's model as providing a baseline, we can then compare that to the retreat curriculum at other retreat centers around the world. For one, I know of no other retreat center outside of Tibet that does anything close to what Kongtrul prescribes in terms of having a multi-sectarian retreat. Most retreat centers are dedicated specifically to one sectarian tradition and might dabble a little bit in a second tradition, but it goes no further than that. Secondly, the retreat programs that I'm familiar with cover far less ground than Kongtrul's extremely ambitious program. They typically do the preliminaries, followed by various forms of guru yoga. There may be practices like mind trading and cutting. Then they may do a full set of mantra recitations for 3 or so deities, and then the 6 yogas of Naropa. And then towards the end, there's normally 1 or 2 more deities that they practice. In terms of content, this is far, far less than what Kongtrul prescribed. One of the things I'm tracking in my interviews is how the curriculum may have changed at any given retreat center. And almost every center, as I talk to them, they say, we're doing less than they used to do. And when I did the retreat, it was too much. So now we're cutting out and doing less and doing less and doing less. There are some retreat centers on the West, even Kagyu retreat centers, where they're no longer doing the 6 yogas of Naropa. They say it's just too hard for us Westerners. Part of this is the question of preparation, right? In Tibet and in Tibetan communities in Asia, typically these are monks and nuns who've been training in this system for decades, who fully know Tibetan and so on. In the West, these are lay people who have normally a very limited facility with Tibetan. Maybe they've been practicing Tibetan Buddhism for a decade or more, but it's not their full-time pursuit. In some retreat communities, especially in France, they've taken to saying that really you should do 2 3 or 3-month retreats for a Westerner. The first one is to basically learn Tibetan and the basic ritual forms and sort of familiarize with all this stuff. And then if you do a second one, then you can maybe do real religious practice. Now, on the question of curriculum, some retreat centers are taking this evolution, I think, a great leap forward. A prominent Tibetan Lama creating a new retreat center from scratch in Portugal has suggested that the curriculum will be taken up almost entirely with shamatha and vipassana, which are exoteric meditation practices of central importance to the contemporary mindfulness movement. In traditional Tibetan Buddhist retreats, only about a month would be dedicated to these forms of meditation, just after completing the preliminary practices, before delving as quickly as possible into deity-based tantra, which is the real focus. So making these exoteric practices the focus of the retreat represents a huge leap forward in revolutionizing the meaning and the purpose of the retreat being tailored to meet the expectations of a Euro-American audience. So this question of the curriculum is one of the biggest issues that emerges from my research. I think it exposes assumptions about what the purpose of the retreat is in a very important way. It raises the question of the extent to which these centers feel beholden to tradition and the extent to which they feel free to innovate and throw those precedents away. I'm going to sort of skip forward a little bit here and just talk briefly about a couple more points before my closing reflections. Related to this question of the curriculum, I think is the question of the 3 or 3 months retreat's role in the routinization of meditative charisma, another thing that John alluded to in his introduction. The 3 or 3-month retreat serves an important credentializing function. Traditionally, this has qualified a person as a quote unquote Lama, which is an important step to becoming a leader in the community. At the retreat center in France that I mentioned that at one point had more than 100 meditators, they have an annual meeting where all the people who've completed the retreats there come back, and they have sort of a conference, and they talk about the community, and they have voting rights within the community to talk about the future of it. So it really serves this important purpose in globalized Tibetan Buddhism today of sort of credentializing people. But the question then becomes, if we change the contents of the retreat too much, will it sort of lose that importance that it has had for a long time? Related to this is that we have to think about the 3 or 3 month retreat in maintaining global networks of Tibetan Buddhists. The fact that the retreat that they're doing in upstate New York or in France is quote unquote the same as the traditional form of retreat is very important in sort of maintaining connections between here and there and past and present. Now, there's one last point I want to talk about briefly, something that emerged again and again in my interviews. One of the things I always ask is, what was the hardest thing about the retreat? Which I think is going to be revealing of people's assumptions and their experience. In Nepal, I received all different kinds of answers. But in France, every single person I spoke to, this is about 30-something people, said the exact same thing. The hardest thing about the retreat was dealing with the other people. Why does the person in the room next to me have to bang their drum so loud? Why does so-and-so say such annoying things over breakfast? Why does so-and-so go so fast when they're leading the liturgy and so on? Just that people getting annoyed with one another based on the sort of enclosed circumstances of the retreat. I spoke to one older woman who did her 3-year retreat in her 60s after retiring from a career as a social worker. And she said that she felt like, this is really quite sad. She said she felt like the other women that she was with for those 3 years and 3 months just didn't like her. And she said that she spoke less and less, such that by the end of the 3 years and 3 months, she basically stopped speaking altogether, which we can think of as kind of the ascetic goal, but it's also very sad if that's the reason why she came to basically give up speaking. So to close, as I said, I'm still in the early stages of this project. To this point, it's all been kind of an experiment. My interviews have been about fleshing out the picture of the tradition and educating myself as much as possible about what this 3-year retreat is and what it's about. I think this project will ultimately address a handful of important themes. One is spiritual authority and the place of meditation in Tibetan Buddhism today. The specific means by which Tibetan Buddhism is maintained as a globalized religion. How Tibetan Buddhist communities make decisions about challenges that arise, stemming specifically from the natural underlying tension between innovation and adherence to tradition as this practice spreads to completely new parts of the world. And I think maybe the biggest sort of central issue that this research is going to get to is this question of there being a broader long-term shift from a view of meditative practice in which meditation is thought of as ritual, or at least as something cognate with ritual, or something viewed through a lens that takes ritual for granted, shifting to a view that sees meditation, a view of meditation that sees ritual as secondary, if it has any real need or purpose at all. This is the modern view of meditation, coming directly out of secular, scientific, Protestant, and capitalistic assumptions. And this is an extremely powerful force in our world today. Will the expectations at the core of the mindfulness boom even cycle back into the discourse and practices of more traditional Tibetan Buddhist communities? Will there be a rift between the more traditional Tibetan and then the more modern and westernized versions of the 3-year, 3-month retreat? So these are a number of the bigger questions that I'll be tracking in the years ahead. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer questions about either of these 2 projects. Thank you.